Last year, Princess Kate briefly disappeared due to health issues, which sparked rumors about a third party in her marriage, even claims she'd been harmed. Why is everyone obsessed with Princess Kate? Starting in the 20th century, European royalty is basically civilianized. Princess Kate's journey, from a true commoner to a globally watched princess, matched exactly what the public wanted to see. That's why her marriage to Prince William was put under a microscope, and why so many people feared she might end up as the next Diana. One big reason Princess Kate keeps getting compared to Princess Diana is that they share the same title, Princess of Wales. If all goes according to plan, both were meant to become future queens of the Commonwealth. But royal infidelity has a long history, one that has triggered scandals, tragedies, and even international disasters. So today, let's dive into the stories of Europe's royal mistresses. First, let's talk about Princess Diana. It's been over 20 years since Princess Diana passed away, but she's still incredibly loved in the UK. A lot of people think she was a commoner, but that's actually a misconception. Her father was the 8th Earl Spencer, making her part of the aristocracy. Before he ever married Diana, Charles was already involved with Camilla, who was married. But with the pressure of the monarchy and public image, that relationship had to stay hidden, so he needed a compliant young woman to play the role of the perfect princess. Diana, aristocratic, innocent, fit the bill perfectly. You could say that from day one, Diana was nothing more than a pawn on Charles's chessboard. Shortly after getting engaged to Charles, Diana realized Camilla was still there. She stayed silent, believing that love might change him. But even after Prince Harry was born, Charles kept seeing Camilla. That was the breaking point. Diana finally confronted him, asking why he was cheating. Charles's answer was chilling. He said he didn't want to be the only British heir without a mistress. Stuck in a broken marriage, Diana felt desperately insecure. She grew emotionally attached to the bodyguard who stayed with her day and night. In an interview, she confessed, "He was the only one who made me happy." Not long after, the royal family seemed to catch on and removed the bodyguard from her side. Diana was left alone once again. She sank into severe depression and made 4 suicide attempts. Unable to endure the marriage any longer, she ultimately chose divorce. After the divorce, Diana threw herself into charity work. She visited orphanages, hugged AIDS patients others were afraid to touch, and became a global voice against landmines. Though she had left the royal family, she found her true self, and earned even deeper love from the public. Sadly, that freedom was short-lived. In 1997, Diana lost her life in a tragic car accident. Even though Diana was no longer part of the royal family, her standing with the public meant her funeral was held with full royal protocol. Over 1 million people filled the streets of London, and more than 250 million people worldwide watched it live. At the ceremony, the Queen herself bowed in respect. William and Harry were heartbroken, but many noticed that Charles showed no obvious sign of grief. As the nation mourned, public anger quickly turned toward the royal family. Some accused the palace of ordering MI6 to eliminate Diana and demanded answers. It became the greatest crisis the British monarchy had faced since World War II, at a time when Britons were already deeply divided over whether the monarchy should survive at all. Losing his mother at young age, watching his father marry his mother's mistress, planted the seeds of resentment deep in Prince Harry's heart. This later became a major factor in his complete break with the royal family. In 2005, when Charles married Camilla, Prince Harry once again showed unmistakable anger. Perhaps that resentment is something that will never fully fade from his life. Of course, these royal mistresses didn't just affect relationships within the royal families. They influenced the fate of entire nations and the world. For example, Crown Prince Rudolf of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and his lover. Rudolf was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth. From the day he was born, he was destined to be the one and only heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the age of 22, Rudolf was assigned a bride by his father, a Belgian princess meant to become his future wife. But the free-spirited Rudolf hated the match. So he started looking for lovers of his own, and one of them was a young woman named Mary Vetsera. Mary Vetsera was the daughter of a Hungarian noble. In the spring of 1888, after meeting Rudolf in Vienna, they officially began their affair at the Hofburg Palace. As their relationship grew more serious, Rudolf started thinking about divorcing his official wife, Princess Stephanie. He even wrote a letter to the Pope asking to annul the marriage. Back then, royal divorces in the Catholic Church had to get the Church's approval. Without it, the divorce couldn't happen. For example, the Church of England broke away from the Roman Catholic Church because King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, but the Pope refused. So Henry just split from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England. After the Pope received Rudolph's request, he informed Emperor Franz Joseph. After all, this was a big deal and the head of the family needed to know. When Franz Joseph found out, he confronted Rudolf and threatened to take away his inheritance if he didn't end things with Mary Vetzera. At the time, Rudolf agreed. But just 3 days later, on the morning of January 30th, 1889, Rudolf and Mary Vetzera died by suicide together at the hunting lodge in Mayerling. You gotta admit, these two lovers were pretty intense. Back then, mistresses was pretty common. Just kept things under the radar, no need to suicide. Of course, Rudolf's suicide had other reasons too, like political differences with his father. Before her death, Mary Vetzera left a suicide note for her mother. "Dear mother, forgive me for what I have done. I could not withstand love. In accordance with his wishes, I want to be buried beside him in All Ends Cemetery. I am happier in death than I was in life. Yours, Mary." The letter makes it clear just how deep their feelings were. But this death also set off a chain reaction in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After Rudolf's death, Emperor Franz Joseph had no choice but to name his nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, as the heir. But Ferdinand fell in love with Sophie, the daughter of a Bohemian count. Under Austro-Hungarian law, Bohemian counts were not considered nobility, so Emperor Franz Joseph opposed the marriage. Under Ferdinand's intense insistence, the emperor had no choice but to give in, but only with conditions. Sophie would never be given the same status as Ferdinand. She couldn't be called crown princess, couldn't even sit beside him in public, and their children would have no right to inherit the throne. As a result, Sophie lived a pretty stifled life in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Honestly, I think Emperor Joseph was way too stubborn. He made Ferdinand the heir, but still kept him on a tight leash. And if Sophie and Ferdinand's kids were barred from inheriting the throne, then who else was Joseph going to hand it over to? Did Joseph have another heir? That's actually hard to say. Emperor Joseph had lovers of his own, and interestingly enough, this one was introduced to him by his wife, Empress Sisi. She was a ballet dancer. And Empress Sisi herself also had a lover, her horseback riding instructor. Long story short, Emperor Joseph didn't seem to learn a single lesson from his son's fate. And shifting back to Ferdinand, oddly enough, there was a loophole in Joseph's rules. If Ferdinand showed up to an event as a military officer, his wife could be there with him. And that small exception ended up planting the seeds for the next tragedy. At this point, we need to talk about the tensions between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Serbia. In 1878, the Treaty of Berlin recognized the Principality of Serbia as a sovereign, independent state. But in reality, its king still had very close ties to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and militarily, Serbia was under Austro-Hungarian control, even like a vassal state. That relationship didn't change until May 1903. Back then, Serbia went through a military coup. The old king was taken down, and a descendant of a national hero was put on the throne. Nationalism took over, and Serbia started clashing with the Austro-Hungarian Empire militarily. It's basically like saying, I beat the enemy, and now you, the boss behind the curtain, are my enemy as well. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, where there was a large Serbian population. Serbia wanted to unite that region with itself but was beaten to it by Austria-Hungary, which only made Serbia hate Austria-Hungary even more. A few years later, in 1914, Emperor Joseph planned a military exercise in Bosnia targeting Serbia as the enemy, and he sent Archduke Ferdinand to inspect it. Serbia was already mad at Austria-Hungary, but this just blew up their anger. You took our land and now you're running military exercises here? No way we're letting that slide. As we said earlier, Ferdinand could bring his wife Sophie along when he showed up as a military guy. Maybe he wanted to give her some support and a moment to be seen and cheered by the crowd. So he brought Sophie with him to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, to check out the event. What they definitely didn't see coming was that while they were riding in the convertible heading to City Hall, 6 assassins from the Serbian Black Hand ambushed them. The assassins tossed grenades at Ferdinand's car, but luckily Ferdinand reflexively blocked one with his hand, making it roll off and explode behind the car, only hurting some guards and people nearby. Ferdinand then decided to switch things up and visit his wounded aide at the hospital, but his staff forgot to inform the lead car, so the convoy kept going as planned. When they got to Latin Bridge, an assassin named Princip was waiting just around the corner. He fired 2 shots from less than 6 feet away. Archduke Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife were shot dead. The assassin swallowed poison to kill himself right after, but it didn't work. He even tried to shoot himself, but the gun jammed, and he ended up getting caught. Ferdinand's death almost broke Emperor Joseph. His only son had killed himself earlier, and that same year his wife, Empress Sisi, was murdered by an Italian anarchist. Now, his nephew and heir was assassinated. That kind of hit is just too much for anyone. So on July 28, 1914, Emperor Joseph declared war on Serbia, kicking off World War I. It might look like all this royal chaos just causes trouble, but that's not totally true. For instance, Denmark, the fairy tale kingdom, had a well-known lover who almost fast-tracked their democracy by more than a century. On 1737, Struensee was born in Germany. After graduating from Halle University Medical School at 20, he mingled with many Danish nobles and became a supporter of the Enlightenment, writing a lot about Enlightenment ideas. At 31, he was recommended by a count to King Christian VII of the Denmark-Norway Union and became the king's personal physician. Christian VII was kind of neurotic. A year after marrying Caroline, sister of England's King George III, he started an affair with a geisha because he thought Caroline wasn't stylish enough. This made his relationship with Queen Caroline really cold. Once Struensee became the king's doctor, he helped smooth over some of the awkward moments caused by the king's quirks, earning the trust of the king and his ministers pretty fast. At first, Queen Caroline wasn't fond of him, but since the king was distant, Struensee was one of the few who showed her real care and helped her through tough times. Before long, he became the queen's lover. He was also tight with the crown prince, teaching him Rousseau's Enlightenment philosophy and pushing him to manage most of his own business. At second year, Struensee was appointed by the king as a Privy Council advisor, and soon after, the king's mental issues resurfaced. In just 2 short years, the queen's lover rose from a physician to the de facto ruler of the Denmark-Norway Union. That's when Struensee really kicked off his reforms. He fired nearly all the top officials and even scrapped the role of governor of Norway. From December 1770 to 1772, just 16 months, he issued at least 1,069 decrees. These included legalizing adultery, abolishing torture, banning the colonial slave trade, redistributing land to peasants, ending press censorship, and abolishing noble privileges, along with a whole series of unjust institutions. Almost all of these reforms would still be considered highly progressive even by today's standards. At the top, a lot of these reforms hit the nobles right in their own interests, which made them furious. And with press censorship gone, the nobles immediately used that freedom against him. Soon, anti-Struensee books started popping up everywhere. At the bottom, because Struensee had completely pushed the king aside, people believed he and the queen were manipulating the monarch together. Because, outside of a handful of people at court, no one in the general public knew the king had mental health issues. In 1771, Caroline had a daughter for him, making the public think the monarchy was being disrespected. Then, in January the next year, the nobles staged a coup under the Queen Dowager's name and arrested Struensee and the queen. On April 27th, Struensee had his right hand cut off, was then beheaded, his head put on display, and his body dismembered. Just like that, the 16-month Struensee era was over. Actually, not all nobles saw Struensee as a power-hungry traitor. For example, King Christian VII himself, who was often seen as a puppet, thought Struensee was a great man. 3 years after Struensee's death, the king wrote in German, "I truly wanted to save them both." Reading this, you get the sense that the king actually wanted to save them but felt powerless to do so. So, who or what made the king so helpless? That's definitely something worth digging into. Looking back today, even though Struensee took power in a somewhat shady way, there's no doubt he was a true revolutionary, actively pushing the country toward a more civilized future. The problem was he was a bit too impatient and rushed, and that's what led to his tragic end. So, after covering the politically driven royal lover, let's talk about the ones who were all about the arts. There's one mistress in European royal history who's super famous, practically a legend in the art scene. French King Louis XV had many famous mistresses, but the most famous was Madame de Pompadour, known as the official mistress, and the top beauty of Louis XV's era. At 19, Pompadour married Charles and, with his help, set up her own salon. This wasn't just any salon. Even Voltaire was a regular guest and praised her for having a sharp, delicate mind and a heart full of justice. Madame de Pompadour wasn't just smart, she was also pretty strategic. King Louis XV often hunted in the woods near her home, so during those times, she took carriage rides through the forest to catch his attention. Pretty soon, the king was hooked, and she became his mistress. After entering the Palace of Versailles, she showed off serious emotional intelligence. Unlike other royal mistresses who fought over the king, Pompadour submitted to the queen. She was really good at flattering the queen. For example, she pushed the king to pay off the queen's gambling debts, and when Versailles was being redecorated, she made sure the queen's bedroom was lavishly decorated while keeping her own room modest. This helped her quickly form an alliance with the queen, who had little background and was aging. Together, they could suppress the king's other lovers and secure Pompadour's place in the palace. Just as Voltaire said, Madame de Pompadour had both breathtaking beauty and a brilliant. She wasn't like other mistresses who served as nothing more than sexual companions. Instead, she was deeply involved in France's culture, art, and politics. Culturally, she supported the French Enlightenment, even though the Enlightenment openly opposed people like her. She not only sponsored Voltaire, but also funded Diderot's work on the Encyclopedia. Some of the greatest thinkers in history, including Rousseau and Montesquieu, were also her close friends. In the arts, she was a true architect of Rococo. Drawing inspiration from Chinese techniques, she produced Rococo-style porcelain and pioneered gilding on porcelain surfaces. Her porcelain factory remains one of the most famous in Europe to this day. She also sponsored the great painter François Boucher and Boucher's students, helping push Rococo art to its absolute peak. She carried on France's dance traditions and funded major projects like theaters, the Place de la Concorde. You could say that during the reign of Louis XV, it was truly Madame de Pompadour's era. In politics, Madame de Pompadour basically acted as France's prime minister, and that's exactly where most of the controversy comes from. It was under her push that Louis XV entered the 7 Years' War against Britain. She was so deeply involved that even generals at the front received battle maps she had drawn with her eyebrow pencil. In 1763, she helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris with Britain. The war was a disaster for France, costing it massive losses. From that point on, she was often painted as the person responsible for France's defeat, as if her influence alone caused the decline of the French Empire. So her famous phrase, "After me, the flood," later took on another meaning, "After me, I don't care the flood." In my view, once the Enlightenment began, it was inevitable that absolute monarchy would eventually give way to constitutional monarchy. That shift really didn't have much to do with Madame de Pompadour. Alright, that wraps up today's story about royal mistresses. Thanks for watching.